Supply and demand, a force of human nature. To begin with, we need to recognize that we currently live in a market-driven economy versus a command economy. In a market-driven economy, the consumer ultimately determines what is produced, and thus how the assets are allocated for production. In a command-driven economy, a central authority dictates production. The Central Bureau of Planning will determine how many of which kinds of shoes to be produced, and that's what will be produced. But in order to understand how our economy works, the market-driven economy, you have to understand supply and demand. Now, some of you are probably cringing right now because, as we all know, economics is referred to as the dismal science, and we're about to see why. Supply and demand really is simply a mechanism that establishes how scarce resources within an economy are allocated. These resources tend to be the resources of production: land, labor, and capital. Supply and demand works in accordance with human nature. That's what makes it so powerful. People seem to have an innate desire for more rather than less. And people care more about themselves and their family than they do about strangers. If they don't, we typically refer to these people as saints or martyrs, but most people fall in the major category of just regular people. Finally, supply and demand really only works if prices are allowed to move. We'll see later on that prices are how the suppliers and the consumers talk to each other. So here we go, the supply curve. Supply curve simply shows that as the market price for a good or service increases, suppliers will provide more of it. They're trying to maximize their profits. They're looking out for their own interest. So current suppliers will shift production from other, less valued products, or they will increase capacity to supply more of the product. Finally, new suppliers will also enter the market to supply more of the product. In most charts, the supply curve slopes upwards, which we'll see later on in the presentation. The other side is the demand curve. The demand curve simply shows that as the price of a good or service decreases, current consumers will want more of it. Things go on sale, we buy more of them, ties, shirts, etc. We will satisfy pent-up demand for the product. We may have wanted it, but we couldn't afford it, but now we can afford it because it's gone on sale, or we may even find additional uses for the product. It happens. Finally, new consumers may also enter into the market. So if I would like a Lamborghini, but the price is too high, I'm not really in the market for a Lamborghini. But if the price drops to $10,000, I may enter the market. In most charts, the demand curve slopes down. Again, we'll see that coming up. So let's look at a supply and demand model. Here we have a typical supply and demand model with prices on the vertical axes going up and quantity on the horizontal axes going out to the right. As prices increase, it goes up. As quantity increases, it goes up to the right. So as advertised, here's our supply curve. Again, as prices increase, the quantity supplied by the supplier increases. Again, they're trying to maximize their profits and look out for their own interests. Again, as advertised, here's the demand curve. As prices go down, the quantity increases. Not surprising. Where the two lines intersect, the market is at equilibrium. So what this means is that at that price level and at that quantity, there is no signal being sent to the producer to either add assets to make more of this good or to remove assets because there's too much out there. It's basically steady. Almost everything being produced is being sold. Here's where the economists stepped in and made things a little more confusing with the phrases increase in supply and an increase in demand. An increase in supply means that producers are inclined to supply more at all price points. The curve that we just saw actually moves out. Unlike an increase in the quantity supplied, which simply means that producers are responding to rising prices and shifting production to produce more for sale at the higher price point. The difference is the change in the price points. Likewise, an increase in demand means that increased consumer demand exists at all price points. again, the curve will shift out. An increase in the quantity demanded means more consumption of a product is taking place because of a drop in prices. Obviously, where we have increase, we can also substitute decrease, and the lines will shift in the opposite direction. The main thing to remember is the movement of the line versus movement along the line. We'll show that here in a second. So let's talk about an increase in supply. So as we just talked about, when an increase in supply happens, the entire supply curve shifts out. At the current or existing price levels, though, the quantity supplied is now much greater than the quantity demanded at that price. So what happens is the goods will remain on the shelf and will not be sold. Therefore, the suppliers have to lower their prices to either increase consumption among the current consumers or to bring more consumers into the market. Note that the demand curve has not shifted. So now there's lower prices. The suppliers, or at least some suppliers, will reduce the production. They will shift their assets to produce something else because they're not making the profits that they need to make. So the prices indicate to the suppliers to remove assets from the market. The end result, though, is the quantity supplied does increase and it's at lower prices. So depending on where you are on this equation, either a supplier or a consumer, and what good we're talking about, this could be a good thing. More has been supplied at lower prices. An increase in demand works similarly. Note the entire line shifts outwards, but at the existing price levels now, the quantity demanded is much greater than the quantity supplied. At this point, the goods are flying off the shelves, and the retailers are experiencing stockouts. Now, they're not stupid. They want to maximize their profits. They want to look out for their own best interests, so they're going to raise prices because the market will bear them. Higher prices will then encourage more suppliers into the market because they can make pretty good profits. They may shift capacity from one product to this new product that has a higher price. Again, there is more supply, but at higher prices. And again, the signal to the suppliers to move assets, to reallocate assets to production, was the change in prices. So let's talk about prices. In a typical market, the mechanism suppliers and consumers use to communicate is prices. In free markets, the price is constantly adjusting. There's numerous impacts going on, numerous transactions taking place, and so really the price is not stable, but moves around in a pretty narrow range. It's always seeking to move towards equilibrium. Meaningful price ceilings and floors actually distort the market and keep the market from allocating assets as efficiently as possible. So in conclusion, we live in a market-driven economy. Supply and demand are actually the underpinnings of this economy. Supply and demand work in accordance with human nature. Everybody's trying to look out for themselves. That's the beauty of it. Supply and demand allocate how land, labor, and capital are allocated to production to maximize the benefit for the economy as a whole. Prices must have the freedom to move for supply and demand to be efficient.